Hi, I'm Alex from The Last Climb, and today I'm uncovering the most terrifying Everest deaths ever recorded. A mountain that, to me, represents the ultimate test of human limits. From a father who dragged his violently sick son up the mountain, despite every expert telling him to turn back, to a climber who unclipped from safety ropes at 29,000 feet just to take a selfie, which, believe me, ended in the most brutal way possible. It was June 23, 2016, at Everest Base Camp, where unusually warm pre-monsoon temperatures hung in the air. The tent city buzzed with climbers preparing gear and rotations, while thin air carried the scents of stoves, glacier ice, and yak meat. And prayer flags snapped against the Khumbu Glacier. Kendall Wexford, a 28-year-old pharmaceutical sales manager from Seattle. She had built her career on aggressive efficiency, refusing to accept delays or limitations, and approached mountaineering with the same mindset. Wexford's experience included moderate peaks in Nepal and the Pacific Northwest, but none involved technical glacier travel, rope team coordination, or high-altitude hazards above 20,000 feet. She had hired a mid-tier Nepali guiding company and considered their role primarily as logistical support rather than technical instructors, viewing safety protocols as optional barriers to completing her summit push on schedule. Wexford repeatedly dismissed concerns about warm temperatures and unstable snow bridges, arguing that speed and efficiency were more important than caution. Over the following days, she ignored standard rope team procedures, skipped team briefings, criticized base camp logistics, and insisted on advancing ahead to demonstrate her preferred pace, leaving guides frustrated and increasingly concerned for her safety. The first glacier rotation to Camp 1 exposed the risks of her approach. Crossing crevasse fields at high altitude, Wexford hesitated and rushed intermittently, ignoring probe testing. Her guides attempted to enforce rope travel and spacing, but she unroped herself and advanced ahead. Warm conditions had softened snow bridges, making them unpredictable under weight. At Camp 1, she demanded minimal rest and insisted the team maintain her schedule, dismissing recommendations to pause until ice and snow conditions stabilized. On the second rotation toward Camp 2, Wexford continued to flout standard safety protocols. She pressured her guides to increase the pace, skipped proper spacing in the rope team, and refused to probe or test snow bridges at critical crevasse crossings. Even under repeated warnings, she insisted on advancing alone, ignoring flexing snow bridges and the unstable conditions caused by unusually warm temperatures at high altitude. While crossing a visibly weakened snow bridge spanning a wide crevasse, the structure collapsed beneath her, sending her plunging into the narrow chasm. During the fall, she struck sharp ice edges and a protruding rock shelf, fracturing both femurs and sustaining severe internal trauma. Her backpack and helmet shifted violently, causing additional blunt force injuries as she tumbled against the crevasse walls. The crevasse was too narrow for rescuers to see her directly, and the high walls reflected sound poorly, making communication nearly impossible. Her headlamp illuminated only a small area around her, revealing snow debris and ice shards, but no stable footing. Blood loss, shock, and blunt force trauma caused her to lose consciousness within 20 minutes, leaving her completely dependent on technical rescue teams to reach her before prolonged exposure worsened her condition. The guides immediately initiated crevasse rescue procedures, but warm snow and unstable anchors significantly slowed operations. A satellite call to coordinate additional support confirmed that helicopter evacuation was impossible due to rotor hazards over the narrow opening. Ground-based technical rescue teams required 4 hours to reach the location with specialized equipment. Wexford's body was recovered at 12:30 p.m. The medical examiner determined death was due to massive internal bleeding from blunt force trauma sustained during the fall, with contributing factors including bilateral femur fractures and early hypothermia from exposure. The incident reinforced the extreme hazards of high-altitude glacier travel in unstable conditions and underscored the necessity of strict adherence to guide authority and rope team protocols. Expedition companies subsequently revised safety agreements to prevent clients from overriding technical instructions during hazardous climbs. It was April 27, 2015. The Khumbu icefall stretched before dawn under clear Himalayan skies, its maze of seracs and crevasses glowing pale blue in the pre-sunrise light. Darren Evergreen, a 39-year-old construction foreman from Oregon, prepared for his rotation through the icefall with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Darren had built his career managing construction crews across the Pacific Northwest, earning respect for his technical skills and ability to work at dangerous heights. He'd taken up mountaineering 5 years earlier, attempting increasingly challenging peaks. Everest represented the ultimate test, and he'd saved for 3 years to afford the commercial expedition fee. What his teammates didn't know was that Darren had been using alcohol to manage his anxiety for nearly a decade. Mountaineering on Everest demands split-second decisions and precise physical coordination as climbers navigate through the Khumbu icefall, where massive blocks of glacial ice shift constantly, creating deadly crevasses that can swallow a person instantly, requiring ladder crossings over 100-foot drops, where one misstep means certain death. The icefall changes daily as the glacier moves downward at rates exceeding 3 feet per day, making previously safe routes lethal overnight. Darren had trained on technical ice climbing in Washington, but nothing truly prepares someone for the Khumbu's chaotic, ever-shifting terrain. The night before his scheduled rotation, Darren's anxiety likely reached a breaking point. Other climbers heard him pacing his tent at base camp, muttering to himself about the dangers ahead. Around 10 in the evening, he retrieved a flask from his pack and drank heavily, consuming roughly 3 to 4 ounces of whiskey to calm his nerves. He barely slept, spending most of the night alternating between drinking and staring at his tent ceiling. At 4:30 in the morning, when his team gathered for the pre-dawn departure, Darren looked terrible. His face was pale and drawn, his movements sluggish and uncoordinated. 2 teammates commented on his condition, suggesting he skip the rotation, but Darren insisted he was fine, just tired. The expedition leader, facing tight scheduling pressure to move clients through acclimatization rotations, reluctantly agreed to let him continue. Darren started the climb, already dehydrated, his body processing alcohol instead of preparing for extreme physical exertion at 17,600 feet. By 6:45 in the morning, the team reached one of the icefall's most technical sections, where 3 aluminum ladders had been lashed together to bridge a 35-foot crevasse. Darren's delayed reactions had become obvious. He moved slowly, his crampons scraping awkwardly against the ice. Teammates ahead and behind watched nervously as he approached the ladder crossing, his hesitation evident in every movement. Darren stepped onto the first ladder section, gripping the fixed rope with both hands, but he was not clipped to the safety line. His movements were mechanical, unnatural, reaching the junction between the second and third ladder, where a thin snow bridge had formed alongside the aluminum. Darren made a catastrophic error. Instead of staying centered on the ladder, he shifted his weight onto the snow bridge, perhaps seeking more stable footing. The bridge was barely 6 inches thick. The collapse was instantaneous. The snow gave way like tissue paper, and Darren dropped through the gap with no time to react. His drunk, dehydrated body couldn't execute the instinctive grab for the ladder that might have saved him. He fell roughly 40 feet into the crevasse, his body striking the ice walls 3 times during the descent, before landing on a narrow ledge deep inside the frozen chasm. The sounds of impact echoed up through the crevasse opening. Darren was not wearing his helmet during the rotation, leaving his head unprotected during the fall. The climber directly behind Darren immediately radioed base camp at 6:52 in the morning. A rescue team mobilized immediately and reached the site within 45 to 75 minutes, rappelling into the crevasse with medical equipment. Darren was unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular, blood pooling beneath him on the ice ledge. They extracted him using complex rope systems, placing him in a cervical immobilization harness and attempting to manage hypothermia, but he died during the evacuation, roughly 90 minutes after the fall. The medical examination at base camp determined Darren had sustained massive internal bleeding from ruptured organs in his chest and abdomen, along with severe head trauma from striking the ice walls. His blood alcohol content at the time of death was estimated at 0.12% based on a femoral blood sample taken. Darren's wife Jennifer, who had opposed the expedition from the beginning, was contacted that afternoon. She later told friends that Darren's drinking had been destroying their marriage for years. It was August 14th, 2019. At the foot of Mount Everest, the massive slopes rose into the sky, climbing toward a summit that reached 29,032 feet above sea level. It was the mountain known as the Savage Mountain, the peak that killed 1 in 4 who tried to stand on its summit. A place where preparation, experience, and discipline offered no guarantees. Standing there at base camp was Will Springer, 31. At 31 years old, He was finally here. Everest had lived in his imagination since childhood. Back when he read mountaineering books in his bedroom in Boulder, Colorado, he had memorized summit photographs, studied every route description, and absorbed wind pattern records left behind by climbers before him, as if knowledge alone might persuade the mountain to be merciful. This moment had taken 20 years to reach. 2 decades of smaller summits, weekend hikes through the Rockies, frozen climbs in the Cascades, and punishing training sessions that left his muscles burning and his lungs raw. Every expedition, every altitude simulation, every late night spent poring over mountaineering journals had been another step toward this single goal. Will wasn't wealthy. He worked as a high school geography teacher, but he saved with discipline. Every spare dollar, every tip, every modest bonus from grading papers went into an envelope labeled simply Everest. Frugality became devotion. Discipline became armor against the odds waiting above. Beyond money, he built his body for the climb. Winter ascents in Colorado, summer treks through the Rockies, and weekends dedicated to strength and endurance training became routine. He studied weather systems, altitude sickness, and self-rescue techniques with the same seriousness he brought to the physical work. Every step, every pull-up, every long march under a heavy pack was training not just for the ascent, but for the mental endurance Everest demanded. He measured risks, rehearsed emergencies, and still understood that preparation did not guarantee survival. Before leaving, Will slipped a small, worn photograph of Emma into his jacket pocket. It was a talisman he planned to carry through snowstorms, screaming winds, and every step cut into frozen snow and broken rock. He traced her smiling face with his thumb, fixing her features in memory, imagining her laughter filling their home, a warmth that felt impossibly far from the mountain's cold indifference. He had promised them both that he would be careful, that he would turn back if anything felt wrong, that he wouldn't take unnecessary risks. Jennifer had held him tightly at the airport, lingering longer than usual, reminding him that coming home safely mattered more than any summit. Now, at base camp, 16,900 feet above sea level, Will felt the weight of that promise. But alongside it was something else, the pull of the mountain itself, the gravity of a dream 20 years in the making. The expedition team was small but experienced, 8 climbers in total, supported by high-altitude porters. Leading them was Rashid Khan, a Pakistani mountaineer who had summited Everest 3 times. Rashid was known for his conservative judgment, for turning climbers around when conditions weren't right. That reputation was exactly why Will had chosen this expedition. The strategy was simple. They would establish 4 camps along the south route. Camp 1 at 19,500 feet, Camp 2 at 21,300 feet, Camp 3 at 23,500 feet, and Camp 4 at 26,000 feet. From Camp 4, they would launch their summit attempt. The full schedule, including acclimatization rotations, was expected to take roughly 6 weeks. The first 3 weeks blurred together in a cycle of ascent and descent. Up to Camp 1, then back down. Up to Camp 2, then back down again. It was repetitive and exhausting, but necessary. Acclimatization meant giving their bodies time to adapt to the thinning air, stimulating red blood cell production, and learning to function where oxygen levels were only a fraction of what they were at sea level. Will handled the altitude well. His years of preparation were evident. While some teammates labored for breath and slowed to a crawl, he kept a consistent, controlled pace. Rashid took notice. One evening at base camp, the expedition leader remarked that Will was strong and that his body seemed to adjust well to the elevation. The comment filled Will with quiet confidence. Maybe this was truly within reach, but Everest would decide the timing. In early August, conditions shifted. A powerful storm system settled over the Khumbu region, driving winds across the mountain that approached 100 miles per hour. Snow fell dense and unrelenting. Temperatures at Camp 4 sank to minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit. For 11 days, the team remained at base camp, confined by wind and snowfall, checking weather reports repeatedly and waiting for a window to open. The tent strained beneath accumulating ice. The stove burned constantly. Each blast of wind felt like a reminder of how little control they had. Day after day passed in sameness, a rhythm of restless pacing, dehydrated meals, and low conversations about risk, survival, and the mountain's authority. Above them, Everest slopes remained quiet and distant, a steady reminder that progress would come only when the mountain allowed it. Wind shook the tents without pause, driving snow and shards of ice against the canvas. One day blended into the next, with little to occupy them beyond scanning the sky, tightening lines, checking gear, and pushing back a boredom that felt dense and airless. Climbers spoke quietly about earlier expeditions, about those who hadn't returned, and about the harsh reality that sometimes waiting carried its own risks. Will felt time pressing in from all sides, not only the mountain's schedule, but his own, the family he had promised to come home to, the approaching school year, the life that continued beyond the sharp ridgelines. He tried to remain steady, but the delay wore on him. He had planned to be back by August 20th. Classes began August 26th, and missing the first week wasn't an option. He had already stretched his timeline as far as he could. Each lost day narrowed his chance at the summit. On the 7th day of the storm, Rashid gathered the team and reminded them that the weather was outside their control and that climbing in those conditions would be extremely dangerous. Will knew he was right, even if accepting it felt difficult. Then, on August 12th, the pattern shifted. Forecasts indicated a possible summit window opening on August 15th. It wasn't ideal. The window appeared tight, perhaps 36 hours of workable weather before another system arrived, but it was their chance. Preparations began immediately to move up the mountain the next day. They advanced quickly. On August 13th, the team climbed to Camp 2 and stayed the night. On August 14th, they moved to Camp 3 and, after only a short rest, continued upward to Camp 4. It was faster than preferred. Normally, a full night would be spent at Camp 3, but the limited weather window left little flexibility. Camp 4 rested on a narrow platform carved into the mountain's shoulder at 26,000 feet. Here, they had entered the death zone, the altitude where the human body cannot endure for long. Every hour at this height meant progressive oxygen deprivation, organs working under strain, cells slowly breaking down. At 4 p.m. on August 14th, Will crawled into his tent. His head throbbed. Nausea lingered in his stomach. He forced himself to eat a freeze-dried meal and drink as much water as he could tolerate. Outside, wind struck the tent repeatedly, the fabric snapping sharply in the gusts. Rest didn't come easily. Between the elevation, the tension of the coming climb, and the constant wind, Will drifted in and out of shallow sleep. His thoughts returned again and again to Jennifer and Emma. He pulled out his phone. There was no service at this altitude, and stared at the wallpaper image. Jennifer and Emma at the beach the previous summer, both smiling, sunlight in their hair. He had taken the picture less than a year earlier. It felt far more distant than that. At 11 p.m., Rashid moved from tent to tent, signaling that it was time to wake and prepare to leave in 1 hour. Will's pulse surged as he pulled on his boots, checked his equipment, and clipped into his harness. After 20 years of planning, training, and saving, the moment had arrived. The team gathered outside the tents at midnight. 8 climbers stood in the bitter cold, moving deliberately in the thin air. The temperature hovered at -35 degrees Fahrenheit. Will couldn't feel his toes inside his boots. He stamped his feet, trying to drive blood back into them. They stepped onto the route at 12:15 a.m. on August 15th, 2019. The final pyramid of Everest was a brutal stretch of steep ice, exposed rock, and fixed lines. Will climbed inside the narrow cone of light cast by his headlamp, eyes locked on the crampon points of the climber ahead, advancing one careful step at a time. Thinking had faded. There was no room for strategy or analysis, only motion, step by step. Even so, a quiet part of his mind registered the faint creak of shifting ice, the soft hiss of snow moving somewhere out of sight, a warning he chose not to dwell on. Step, breathe, step, breathe. Each time his crampons bit into the frozen surface, small jolts traveled up his legs. His lungs burned, every breath sharp and thin. Sweat froze along his brow, forming fine crystals that caught the beam of his headlamp. Pain spread through every muscle, yet each controlled movement felt like progress earned. The darkness around him seemed to breathe. The wind moaned across distant ridges. Ice complained under strain, and far below, unseen depths pressed into his awareness, even if he refused to look. Time lost its meaning. The climb became nothing more than light, rope, and motion. The circle of illumination from his headlamp, the fixed line clenched in rigid gloves, the steady crunch of metal on ice. His lungs felt raw, as if scraped with glass, every inhale contested. Sounds carried unnaturally far, wind tearing at the mountain, ice shifting somewhere in the dark, the muted crack of snow echoing through the stillness. Time dissolved. He thought briefly of the mountains he had climbed before, the pages he had studied and memorized, but none of it carried weight here. Only this movement mattered. This step, then the next, then the one after. Existence reduced to its simplest form. At some point, he no longer knew when, the eastern sky began to pale. Morning was approaching. Will lifted his head and saw the summit ridge silhouetted against the slowly brightening horizon. They were near. On Everest, though, near was deceptive. The final stretch, the summit snowfield, was a broad, exposed slope pitched at a frightening angle. A single misstep, one misplaced crampon, and a climber could slide thousands of feet down the face of the mountain. As he reached the Hillary step, Will's legs were on fire, every breath sharp and piercing. His lungs protested violently, each inhale feeling like shards of glass. But the summit was within reach. Perhaps 200 feet of elevation remained. Maybe an hour more. It was still possible. At 9:47 a.m. on August 15, 2019, Will Springer stepped onto the summit of Everest. The rush of emotion struck him with physical force. Tears froze along his cheeks as he lifted his arms, too drained to cheer, smiling behind his oxygen mask. Nearby, his teammates reacted the same way, embracing, crying, snapping photos with unsteady hands. 2 decades of longing had reached their end. Even through the triumph, Will remembered the numbers. Most fatalities on high mountains occurred on the way down, when fatigue dulled judgment. He kept his focus, intent on making it back alive. They remained on the summit for 15 minutes. Will took photos with his phone. The view defied reality, peaks rolling away in every direction, and tried to fix the scene permanently in his mind. Then, together, they turned back toward the long descent. Descending brought its own struggle. In some ways, it was worse than the climb. Will's legs were spent, his knees aching with each movement. The fixed ropes that had guided them upward now served as lifelines, lowering them carefully down the steepest sections. So far, everything remained steady. The weather continued to cooperate. The team was holding together. For the first time, Will let himself believe he might actually pull this off. A quick image passed through his mind. Jennifer in the kitchen making tea, Emma laughing at something he couldn't hear, and he caught himself wondering what ordinary air would feel like again. They arrived back at Camp 4 in the early afternoon. A few climbers suggested stopping there to rest through the night and continue down in the morning, but updated forecasts warned of shifting weather after dark. Remaining in place risked being pinned down for days. The choice wasn't easy, yet the reality of the death zone settled the debate. Every additional hour at that elevation increased the danger. They had to descend. After a brief pause to drink and force down some food, they resumed their descent. The plan was to reach Camp 3 before nightfall. Will moved almost mechanically now, drawing on reserves he hadn't known were there, down the fixed lines, one careful step at a time. His focus had narrowed to a single direction: down, safety, home. They passed Camp 3 around 6:30 p.m. as darkness began to creep across the mountain. Even with light fading, the team chose to continue toward Camp 2 that night. Resting at 20,000 feet was far safer than remaining at 24,000, where altitude and exposure magnified every risk. Too tired to debate, they continued into the dark. It was then that the rhythm shifted. Around 7:45 p.m., with full night settled over the slope, Will was descending along a fixed rope. The pitch was steep, roughly 55 degrees, but not vertical. His headlamp cast a tight beam over the line ahead and the snow beneath his crampons. He was about 1,000 feet above Camp 2, less than an hour from a tent, from hot tea, from relative safety. Will stepped down, transferred his weight, and felt something shift under his right foot. The investigation would later clarify the cause. A patch of aging, fragile ice, likely compromised by repeated temperature swings, had fractured beneath him. His step had provided the final stress needed to break it free. In the instant that followed, Will felt the ground vanish and his body begin to slide. For a split second, the mountain seemed to thunder around him, the sound swallowing thought. Training took over. Will rolled onto his stomach, drove the pick of his ice axe into the slope, and forced the points of his crampons into the ice, executing the self-arrest maneuver he had practiced countless times. The motion was automatic. For a brief moment, it worked. His slide stopped, but the sudden halt twisted his right ankle sharply sideways. He felt and heard a snap, followed by a surge of pain that shot up his leg so violently he nearly lost his grip on the axe. Robin, a climber from Beijing positioned just above him, saw the fall and called out to the others. Rashid moved quickly down the line to reach Will. In the narrow beam of his headlamp, he evaluated the scene. Will was secure for the moment, held in place by his axe and crampons, but the intensity of his pain was obvious. Rashid helped reposition him more safely and clipped him firmly into the fixed rope. Even through the thick mountaineering boot, it was clear the ankle was severely broken, possibly compound. The situation had shifted from serious to critical. Will tried to stand. The instant he placed weight on his right leg, pain detonated through him so fiercely his vision blurred white. At 22,000 feet, in complete darkness, with a climber who could no longer walk, Camp 2, ordinarily less than an hour away, might as well have been miles, the descent had become something entirely different. For the next 4 hours, the team worked to lower Will toward Camp 2. Progress was painfully slow and fraught with risk. 2 climbers braced him from either side as he attempted to hop on his uninjured leg. On steeper sections, they rigged ropes and lowered him carefully. Each shift in position triggered fresh waves of pain through his shattered ankle. Still, they advanced, slowly, methodically, foot by foot. Will drifted between sharp awareness and haze. At times, he was fully conscious, jaw clenched against the pain, calculating each placement of axe and crampon. At other moments, altitude, exhaustion, and the medication Rashid administered pulled him into something unreal. Images surfaced in fragments: Emma's face, Jennifer calling his name, the classroom where he had taught, flickering like an old film. He replayed the single step that had failed him. He gripped the rope, the axe, and the fading clarity of his thoughts, trying to anchor himself as the mountain seemed to tilt and blur with every strained heartbeat. He pictured himself at home, stretched out in bed, wrapped in warmth and soft sheets. Up here, the cold never relented, biting into muscles and joints without pause. Pain and fear lived side by side, with brief flashes of hope, as if some part of him still believed he would survive this, still watch the sun rise over Boulder, still feel Emma's hand in his. Every inch he descended felt like a triumph, and at the same time, a reminder that safety could seem close and yet remain out of reach. His thoughts kept circling back to Jennifer and Emma, to his classroom, to his students. He replayed the moment over and over, angry at himself for that step, for not testing the ice, for letting fatigue dull his caution when it mattered most. They reached Camp 2 at 11:30 p.m. Getting Will inside a tent was another struggle, but eventually he was laid in a sleeping bag, his injured ankle elevated. Rashid cut away the boot. Will cried out as it came off, and examined the injury by headlamp. It was severe. The ankle was massively swollen, twisted at an unnatural angle. Rashid believed it was broken in several places, possibly an open fracture, though there was no way to be certain without imaging. Rashid told him plainly that he needed to be moved down the mountain as soon as possible. A rescue would be attempted in the morning, with a helicopter requested if weather allowed, though flying at this altitude carried serious risk. Most likely, Will would have to be carried all the way to base camp. Will gave a weak nod, barely absorbing the words. The pain medication had dulled his thoughts. All he wanted was sleep. The tent smelled of cold fabric, metal gear, and the faint metallic scent of blood from his ankle. Outside, the wind battered the canvas, each gust sounding like a warning beat. Spent and hurting, he slipped into broken sleep, his ankle pulsing with each heartbeat, while his teammates lay awake, planning routes, weighing options, calculating ropes and manpower. Outside, the mountain stood unmoved. In his dreams, Will drifted through warmth, home, and a life that felt impossibly distant. He woke repeatedly during the night, confused, gasping for air, pain cutting through the haze. At one point, he realized he was shaking uncontrollably. Later, a crushing headache set in, so intense it felt as though his skull might split. By morning, August 16, 2019, something was clearly wrong. Beyond the injury, Will felt off in a deeper way. His thinking was sluggish. Words came slowly. When Rashid spoke to him, Will struggled to respond, his thoughts dragging as if stuck in thick syrup. Everything felt distorted. The sky seemed tilted, sounds stretched and warped. It was as though the world itself was bending under pressure. Rashid recognized the signs immediately. Will was developing high-altitude cerebral edema. Swelling in his brain, combined with shock from the injury, was pushing his body toward failure. The situation had become critical. The swelling alone could be fatal, and delay would only make it worse. They couldn't wait. The team moved at once, but lowering an injured, barely responsive climber down Everest in daylight was only marginally safer than doing it at night, and Will was deteriorating rapidly. They rigged ropes to lower him on the steepest sections. Where the terrain eased, 2 climbers supported him, dragging him between them. Will faded in and out. At times, he understood what was happening. Other moments, he was back at his desk teaching, or standing on a beach with Jennifer and Emma. The descent from Camp 2 to Camp 1 took 6 hours. Under normal conditions, it would have taken 2. At Camp 1, Rashid attempted to call for helicopter evacuation, but the weather was already turning. The narrow window had closed, winds were rising, clouds were building. No aircraft could fly in safely now. They rested for 2 hours at Camp 1, trying to get food and fluids into Will, trying to stabilize him. But the reality was unavoidable. He needed to reach base camp and then a hospital as quickly as possible. That meant continuing down the mountain. The section from Camp 1 to base camp should have been the simplest. The slope was gentler, the altitude gradually lower. Base camp, at 16,900 feet, was where Will's brain could begin to recover. But his body had endured too long in the death zone. The broken ankle, the trauma, the cerebral edema, the exhaustion. It all combined into a perfect storm of failure. Around 4 p.m. on August 16th, as the team carefully moved him down a moderate slope, Will suddenly stopped responding. His eyes were open but unfocused. His breathing had become irregular, shallow, labored. Rashid leaned over him, shaking him urgently, desperate to keep him conscious. Robin checked his pulse. Fast, weak, irregular. Base camp was visible below them, just 30 minutes away, the tents promising safety. Every second felt critical. The team broke into a shuffling run, carrying him between them. His head lolled with each step, his breathing growing more labored. The tents were so close, almost within reach, but the mountain had one final merciless twist to deliver. At 4:17 p.m., less than 15 minutes from base camp, Will Springer's breathing stopped. He was lowered to the ground immediately. Rashid began CPR, pressing on his chest and giving breaths, continuing for 20 minutes. At 21,000 feet, after days in the death zone and multiple organ systems compromised, Will showed no signs of life. At 4:37 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Investigators later determined the cause: high-altitude cerebral edema, worsened by trauma, exhaustion, and the broken ankle, which triggered a cascade of oxygen deprivation his body could not overcome. Rescuers noted his ice axe was worn from repeated self-arrests, his supplemental oxygen nearly depleted, and the tent at Camp 2 frozen solid. Summit photos and route logs confirmed the extreme conditions during the climb. The team carried Will's body the rest of the way to base camp, where the expedition doctor confirmed his death. It was later airlifted from Everest and returned home to Colorado. Jennifer and Emma awaited in solemn silence. Expedition records, gear logs, and witness accounts confirmed that Will had followed safety procedures until the descent. But the combination of altitude, injury, and prolonged exposure proved fatal. Though he had reached the summit, Everest claimed the final toll. Will had survived the peak, but the mountain had the last word. It was May 24th, 2017. The upper southeast ridge of Mount Everest stretched toward the summit under deceptively clear skies. The Hillary Step, crowded with a slow-moving line of climbers fighting thin air and failing judgment. Raphael Martin Mendez, a 34-year-old warehouse supervisor from Arizona, stood among them, hypoxic and fixated on a single goal that had consumed 3 years of his savings and every vacation day he'd accumulated. Raphael had worked double shifts at a regional distribution center helicopter to afford the $65,000 expedition fee paid to a mid-tier commercial guiding company. He wasn't an experienced mountaineer. His preparation included a weekend ice climbing course, 2 months at a high-altitude training facility, and summit attempts on 3 14,000-foot peaks in Colorado. Friends described him as determined but impulsive, someone who set goals and pursued them with tunnel vision, regardless of obstacles. His apartment walls were covered with Everest photos, and he'd told co-workers repeatedly that all he wanted was one picture from the top, proof that he'd made it. Everest's southeast ridge is the most commercially trafficked route to the summit, requiring climbers to ascend fixed ropes through the death zone above 26,000 feet, where the human body slowly shuts down from oxygen deprivation. Just below the summit, the Hillary Step formed a steep, near-vertical rock and ice choke point that forced climbers into a single-file line clipped to one fixed rope. The exact shape had been altered by past earthquakes, but it remained a narrow bottleneck where exhausted climbers had to wait their turn. Polished ice and rock, worn smooth by thousands of crampon strikes, make every movement precarious. Even brief delays at this altitude increase the risk of cerebral edema, exhaustion, and deadly errors in judgment. That morning, Raphael's guide group had departed Camp 4 at 11 p.m., joining hundreds of climbers spread across the route, attempting the summit during a narrow weather window. By 9:30 a.m., they had reached the Hillary Step to find a massive traffic jam. 30 climbers were stacked along the fixed line, waiting as others slowly hauled themselves up the vertical section. Raphael had been climbing for over 10 hours. His oxygen bottle was running low, and his ability to think clearly was severely compromised by altitude. The guide repeatedly ordered the team to stay clipped to the fixed line and wait their turn. Raphael became increasingly agitated about the delay, obsessing over his summit photo and checking his phone camera compulsively despite wearing bulky gloves. Other climbers later reported he kept saying he'd waited too long and spent too much money to not get his picture. At approximately 10:15 a.m., as the line inched forward, Raphael made a catastrophic decision. Noticing a brief gap as the line shifted and believing he could step back on within seconds, Raphael unclipped his safety tether from the fixed line and stepped sideways onto polished rock glazed with crampon-worn ice. He positioned himself near the edge of the steep drop, slid a thin touchscreen liner from his fingertips, and pulled his phone from his chest pocket for what he thought would be a clear selfie with the summit in the background. His crampons scraped against rock worn smooth as glass by thousands of metal points before him. A passing climber's pack clipped Raphael's shoulder as the traffic shifted. The contact was minor, just a brief shove in the congestion, but it broke Raphael's precarious balance. His downhill boot skated sideways on the polished ice. He windmilled his arms desperately, phone flying from his hand, trying to grab the fixed line now 2 feet beyond his reach. His crampon point skidded once, then sheared on a patch of verglass. Raphael went down hard on his side, then began sliding feet first down the steep face below the step. He accelerated rapidly, flipping once as he tried to self-arrest with his ice axe, the pick failing to bite as he struggled to roll into a stable arrest position. The polished ice offered no resistance. 8 climbers watched him cartwheel out of sight, down the Lhotse face, a 7,000-foot drop of mixed rock and ice. Several heard the repeated impacts as his body struck rock outcroppings during the initial portion of the fall, before he disappeared from view. His guide radioed base camp immediately, and nearby teams confirmed the fall, but the terrain and oxygen limits made any immediate rescue impossible at that altitude. A recovery team located Raphael's body 5 days later, wedged in a crevasse at 25,400 feet, after weather conditions allowed a later expedition to descend to the site. On site, analysis confirmed death had occurred within seconds of the initial fall impacts. The summit photo was never taken. Raphael's guiding company settled a lawsuit regarding inadequate client supervision, though the company maintained he'd ignored direct safety orders. It was September 3rd, 2014, at Everest Base Camp during the late monsoon transition. Afternoon clouds formed rapidly over the upper ridges, and lightning had been observed across nearby peaks in recent days. Route managers warned that exposed sections above the South Col offered no shelter, advising climbers to descend promptly if storm conditions developed. Skyler Peton, 26, was a Denver-based social media consultant who had built her online presence around dramatic outdoor content. Her Everest experience consisted of guided rotations in stable weather, where decisions about pacing and safety had been handled by professionals. She framed risk as proof of character, often dismissing caution as weakness, and viewed unpredictable conditions as opportunities to capture compelling footage rather than as hazards requiring restraint. Her stated objective was to live-stream summit content in marginal weather, to distinguish herself from other climbers documenting clear sky ascents. Guides emphasized that lightning above treeline presented uncontrollable danger, and that no equipment could mitigate a direct strike. Pemberton argued that forecasts were exaggerated and insisted on continuing upward despite visible storm formation over nearby ridgelines. By late morning, clouds thickened above the upper slopes. Distant thunder rolled across the mountain, and static electricity began affecting exposed metal equipment. Other climbers began descending in accordance with established safety windows, but Pemberton continued toward the summit, pausing repeatedly to record video commentary about pushing limits in real conditions. Near the summit ridge, electrical activity intensified rapidly. The air carried a metallic odor, and fine hairs on her arms and neck lifted as static built in the charged atmosphere. Faint crackling sounds came from exposed metal along the route, and small blue sparks briefly flickered at the tips of trekking poles nearby. Thunder echoed across surrounding peaks as the storm cell moved directly overhead, reducing visibility in shifting gray cloud. Rather than descending, she stopped on the exposed ridge and positioned her phone on a rock outcrop to capture timed footage against the darkening sky. She adjusted her stance several times to frame the shot, standing fully upright on open ground with no terrain features capable of offering protection. Carabiners on her pack, a metal phone case, and trekking poles in her hands increased conductivity, making her one of the highest points on the ridge. A lightning strike hit the summit area seconds later. The discharge traveled across the rock as ground current, passing through her body via the metal equipment she was holding. The electrical surge disrupted cardiac rhythm instantly and caused deep burns at contact points along her hands and feet. The shock also triggered violent muscle contraction, locking her body rigid before throwing her off balance. She was thrown several feet across uneven stone, striking her shoulder and head against exposed rock. Her phone shattered on impact, and loose equipment scattered across the ridge. She collapsed where she landed, unresponsive, as heavy rain and additional lightning moved across the summit, leaving her fully exposed to the continuing storm. A second strike followed shortly after, striking the same exposed zone as thunder echoed across the ridge. When storm intensity lessened, descending climbers returned cautiously to the summit area and found her unresponsive. Emergency response from lower camps was delayed until lightning activity fully subsided, as rescuers could not enter the exposed zone during active electrical discharge. Medical assessment later confirmed death due to cardiac arrest from lightning strike, with extensive electrical burns and impact injuries documented. Expedition leadership reinforced strict turnaround times during unstable weather and reiterated that exposed high-altitude terrain provides no defense against electrical storms. The incident was recorded as a weather-related fatality, resulting from continued ascent despite clear warning signs. The headlamps created a jagged trail of light climbing into the void, each beam slicing a thin tunnel through air so frigid it stung the chest with every inhale. It was 3:42 a.m. in the Khumbu icefall, and the team advanced through terrain that felt suspended between solidity and motion, between mountain and current, locked in a moment of collapse into towering slabs of ice as large as buildings. Leading was Maytok Sherpa, 41, with 17 successful Everest ascents and a reputation for cautious judgment that had kept him active long after more flamboyant guides had retired or perished. A helmet camera was part of his routine gear, its tiny lens documenting the route in grainy night mode. Bringing up the rear was Anil Rai, 29, efficient in his steps, carrying spare rope and a radio, alive with intermittent route chatter. The third climber in line was Darcy Lee Villain, 27, from Perth, Australia. Her rented gear was pristine, tags freshly removed from her shell trousers. The material still held the stiff folds from manufacturing. Her pack carried a small stitched patch of a film camera, something another client, Leo Gutierrez, had noticed during the approach from Lukla. He had asked about it during a break in Namche Bazaar. She'd replied with a grin that she worked in digital content strategy, that the patch was ironic, film was obsolete, but the style endured. Would her urge to document the ascent take priority over prudence in such unstable terrain? Maytok's helmet footage tracked her from the moment they departed base camp. The recording showed a climber who was capable but measured. She set her crampons down with deliberate stomps rather than the smooth strikes of someone accustomed to ice travel. She double-checked her carabiners, sometimes 3 times, after clipping to the fixed rope. When slack appeared between anchors, her hands stayed tightly wrapped around it, gloves whitening at the knuckles, while others allowed theirs to hang loose. At 4:23 a.m., they encountered their first major challenge, a crevasse crossed by a single aluminum ladder, its rungs glazed with frost. The gap beneath stretched roughly 12 feet, narrow enough that a fall would trap rather than plunge. Maytok crossed first, crampons clinking sharply against metal, the sound echoing in the thin air. One by one, the clients followed, maintaining 3 points of contact, moving with the heightened caution of people performing a maneuver practiced only in controlled settings. Darcy made it across smoothly. Her boots found each rung, her hands stayed steady on the rope. Yet once she unclipped on the far side and stepped onto firm ice, she stopped. She didn't advance to make room for the climber behind. Instead, she slowly rotated her head and shoulders, studying the surrounding seracs, tilted ice cliffs glowing faintly under starlight. She glanced back at the trail of lights behind them. Then she lowered her gaze to the GoPro on her chest harness, its red indicator glowing. She tapped it once to confirm it was still recording. Would capturing the moment cost her valuable time? Maytok's footage shows him signaling forward with a quick motion of his ice axe. Darcy acknowledged with a nod and continued, but the delay had lasted 15 seconds. 15 seconds spent exposed. The fundamental rule, explained to every climber during orientation at base camp, is to keep moving through danger zones. Pausing creates congestion. Congestion extends exposure. Extended exposure increases the mountain's opportunity to strike. Rest breaks are assigned on secure ice shelves, away from threats above, and they are brief. Would she adhere to the protocol, or adjust for the sake of footage? At 4:58 a.m., the team reached another crevasse, this time requiring descent down a ladder set at a 30-degree angle. Darcy climbed down without difficulty, her crampons settling securely on each rung. But after reaching the bottom and unclipping, she stepped aside instead of reconnecting to the next fixed line and proceeding. She pulled her phone from an inner pocket, the screen casting a pale glow in the darkness. Holding it out and angled downward, she opened TikTok and performed a brief, rehearsed movement. A small shoulder shake, a tilt of the head, and a half-beat pause. Motion suited for vertical framing, not precarious footing. Her breathing was audible through Maytok's camera, quick and shallow, betraying exertion she seemed unwilling to acknowledge. Maytok motioned for her to continue. She responded with a thumbs up without looking back. The pause lasted roughly 45 seconds. Above her, Leo Gutierrez waited at the top of the ladder, unable to descend until she cleared the landing area. Another climber waited behind him. Would this compression amplify the consequences of a single mistake? When Darcy finally reattached and advanced, her steps lacked certainty. She placed each foot tentatively, testing before shifting weight. The assurance she'd shown on the ladder, where movement was defined, didn't carry over to the open snow between anchors. Earlier that week at base camp, during a gear check in the mess tent, Darcy had mentioned in passing that this was her first genuine ice route. She added she had attended a seminar in Colorado and done extensive strength training. Her tone was casual, as if the gap between gym readiness and mountain reality were minor. Leo, on his third Everest attempt and experienced in the Andes, had exchanged a look with another climber but stayed silent. He later explained it wasn't his role to assess someone else's preparedness. That responsibility belonged to the guide. Her client profile, reviewed afterward by an operations manager, listed her occupation as digital content strategist and her experience as fitness enthusiast, novice ice climber with 1 seminar. There were no prior high-altitude technical climbs recorded. Her training notes, shared casually over instant coffee at base camp, focused on gym conditioning, balance work, and what she called mental resilience content. Videos documenting her preparation for an audience that had grown from 300 to 4,000 followers in the 6 months before the expedition. Could virtual preparation truly equip someone for the hazards of the Mount Everest icefall? At 6:12 a.m., beneath a low band of seracs that hung over the route like a frozen crest, Darcy slowed once more after unclipping from an anchor. The sky had begun to brighten, shifting from black to deep blue. The seracs emerged as enormous outlines against the early light. She asked Anil Rai to capture a quick shot, gesturing toward the valley behind her, toward base camp far below, and the first glow touching the eastern peaks. Anil pointed uphill toward firmer ice and shook his head. The rule was clear: no optional stops in hazard zones. Darcy moved sideways anyway, choosing a visually open channel between ice blocks where the light was stronger. Her crampon point scraped loudly against solid ice as she adjusted, the sound like blades on glass. Maytok's helmet camera records him calling for forward movement, his tone sharp. Darcy laughed and said she only needed 10 seconds. The pause stretched closer to a minute. Behind them, another team from a different operator was forced to stop mid-ladder, their advance blocked. One of their Sherpas radioed ahead, his voice clipped and professional, requesting that traffic continue moving. Would the growing bottleneck increase the risk for everyone? Leo Gutierrez later remembered Darcy mentioning, during the trek-in, how Everest content performed better when it felt spontaneous. Over Dal Bhat in Ding Boche, she explained that polished footage seemed artificial, while raw moments, unplanned clips, and real reactions drove engagement. She framed the climb less as a mountaineering objective and more as a setting to be handled carefully, but secondary to documentation, arguing that audiences were no longer interested in summit photos, but in the journey itself and its perceived authenticity. At 7:03 a.m., the team reached a ladder series. 3 ladders tied together, spanning a crevasse wide enough that the far side vanished into blue shadow. Maytok crossed first, then each client followed. Darcy hesitated at the top of the final ladder. Instead of stepping off immediately and clearing the landing area, she turned her torso toward Anil and mouthed something. The helmet camera audio is unclear, but Anil's reaction is visible. He pointed sharply uphill, his body language unmistakable. Would she follow the warning or her own creative instinct? Darcy exhaled, her shoulders rising and falling, rolled her neck, and then filmed herself performing a quick foot shuffle while still clipped in. Her motions were stiff and deliberate, lacking the ease of the Sherpa ahead of her. Her crampons repeatedly caught on the ladder rungs, something more experienced climbers adjusted for instinctively by angling their feet outward. When she finally stepped off the ladder, snow had begun to pack beneath her crampon plates, a common issue when temperatures climbed and snow became sticky. She struck one boot against the other to clear it, but the buildup remained. She laughed again and continued upward. By 8:17 a.m., the sun had fully risen. The temperature rose from -15 Celsius toward -5. The seracs began to shine, their surfaces damp with melt. The team moved through a relatively stable snow basin, a flat section between crevasse zones where the risk was lower. Darcy stopped without prompting. Could a seemingly safe moment cause her to underestimate what was coming next? She asked Leo to film her on her own phone, handing it to him with her gloves still on. He accepted it, puzzled, while she stepped back, positioning herself with the icefall behind her, making sure he held the phone vertically, her usual format. She launched into a 20-second routine, a sequence of exaggerated side steps, arm swings, and small hops matching a viral TikTok trend she had been practicing. After finishing, she looked at the screen, frowned, and repeated the exact sequence again, determined to perfect the choreography for her video. By the end, snow had visibly packed beneath both crampon plates. She struck her boots together again, harder this time, and the snow still clung. She crouched and scraped at it with her gloved hand, finally removing most of it. Maytok tapped his watch and signaled for immediate movement, his patience clearly thinning. At 9:15 a.m., Maytok radioed a status update to base camp. His voice, captured on the radio log, indicated the team was slightly behind schedule but progressing. The sun was already striking the upper seracs at a steeper angle than the morning forecast had predicted. Would the quicker warming destabilize the ice before they could reach safer terrain? By his later estimate, the optional stops had added 6 to 8 minutes of stationary exposure across multiple zones. More importantly, they had disrupted the team's rhythm. Darcy moved cautiously when the protocol required flow, and confidently when caution was necessary. Planned rests blurred into unplanned pauses. The ascent no longer felt smooth. it felt interrupted, reactive, shaped by impulses unrelated to the mountain's rules. The icefall did not care about content strategy. It did not care about engagement metrics or audience growth. It functioned on physics, pressure, heat, gravity, time. Every minute spent still allowed the sun to weaken the snow bridges and serric faces. Each unnecessary stop was a gamble that the mountain would remain stable just a little longer. At 10:18 a.m., the team reached the designated rest point, a flat platform of compacted snow, roughly the size of a small room. It sat upwind of a large leaning serac that had begun shedding fine ice grains in the warming air. Maytok's helmet camera shows him signaling a 5-minute halt, shorter than usual, likely intended to recover lost time. The clients unclipped from the fixed line one by one. They dropped their packs. They drank water from insulated bottles, the liquid still barely above freezing. They ate energy gels and chocolate bars that had hardened in the cold. Could the brief pause for nourishment distract from hazards that move silently? The rest platform had supported dozens of teams over the previous weeks, its snow compressed by boots into a surface that felt almost solid, almost dependable. It measured roughly 13 feet across at its widest point, tapering toward the edges where it met the natural contours of the glacier. To the north, a massive serac leaned at an angle that defied logic, its face catching the morning sun and beginning the slow process of surface melt that would accelerate through midday. To the south, the route continued upward through a narrow corridor between ice blocks, the fixed line visible as a thin orange thread against white. The platform appeared uniform. The snow showed no obvious change in color or texture. There were no visible cracks, no depressions, no warning signs that any section differed from another. This was the danger of the Khumbu icefall. It concealed its lethal mechanisms beneath surfaces that looked identical to safe ground. At 10:20 a.m., Darcy removed her backpack and placed it near the center of the platform. The pack landed with a soft thud, settling into the snow. She unzipped the top compartment and pulled out a smartphone in a bright pink protective case, the color almost jarring against the monochrome surroundings. The case was thick, rugged, built to protect against drops and cold. A small loop of paracord hung from one corner. She turned toward Anil Rai, who was checking the anchor where the fixed line ended. She raised the phone and pointed at it, then gestured toward the backdrop. The serac behind her, the valley dropping away to the west, the morning light painting everything in shades of gold and blue. Anil looked at Maytok, who was consulting his altimeter and radio. Maytok glanced over, registered the request, and gave a slight nod. This interaction, while not standard procedure, was not uncommon. Clients paid substantial sums for the Everest experience, and part of that experience was documentation. A photograph at a rest stop was a minor concession. Would granting the documentation briefly compromise operational caution? Anil walked over and took the phone. Darcy smiled, the expression visible even through her neck gaiter and the fatigue that had begun to settle into her features. She said something. The helmet camera audio is unclear, but her lips moved and Anil nodded in response. At 10:21 a.m., Darcy positioned herself roughly 13 feet from the main group, closer to the downwind side of the rest area. The snow here appeared identical to the rest of the platform, white, compacted, bearing faint impressions of previous boots. There was nothing to distinguish it. No discoloration or texture change. No indication that beneath the surface lay anything other than solid ice. She removed her right glove, tucking it into her jacket pocket. Her hand, exposed to air now perhaps -8 Celsius, would begin losing dexterity within minutes. She smoothed her hair where it emerged from beneath her hat, tucked a loose strand behind her ear. She adjusted her neck gaiter, pulling it down to fully expose her face. These were the small vanities that persisted even at altitude, even in environments designed to strip away everything except survival. She took a starting stance, feet together, knees slightly flexed, arms resting at her sides. Her gaze locked onto Anil, who had already started filming, holding the phone upright with both gloved hands. The framing followed typical social media standards: vertical orientation, subject-centered, background included. Leo Gutierrez was seated on his pack 12 feet away, facing Darcy. He had pulled out his own phone to check the time and battery level. The device rested against his thigh, its camera angled upward, recording passively. He would not realize this until later, would not know he had captured anything until reviewing his footage that evening at base camp. Darcy started to move. The motion was simple, matching a widely circulated TikTok dance trend from recent months. A two-step shuffle to the right, then left, paired with a simultaneous arm wave beginning low and sweeping upward. The choreography was designed to fit within 15 seconds, easily remembered, easily copied. It had been performed millions of times in bedrooms and parking lots and beaches, in places where the ground was stable and the cost of a misstep was embarrassment rather than death. On her second shuffle, moving left, Darcy's right crampon packed with a plate of wind-slab snow. The snow accumulated between the crampon points and boot sole, forming a layer that prevented the metal teeth from gripping the surface below. It was a common issue in warming conditions, one that experienced climbers handled by knocking their boots together or scraping the plates with an ice axe. The packed crampon caused her to pitch forward, not backward. Her weight shifted unexpectedly, her arms flailed briefly, an instinctive attempt to regain balance. She dropped into a low crouch, bending at the knees and waist, her bare right hand plunging into the snow for support. The motion appeared sudden but controlled on video. It looked like a practiced recovery, the type of adjustment someone makes when tripping on a curb or slipping on ice. Awkward but manageable, the body's automatic reaction to imbalance. Her hand went through the snow. The snow beneath her hand and right knee did not compress or settle. It fractured instantly, failing as a single unit. A circular section, about 3 feet in diameter, dropped away. The failure was complete and immediate. There was no gradual cracking, no settling, no warning. The snow bridge concealing the void beneath simply ceased to function structurally. And Neil's camera, still recording, captures the moment with brutal clarity. The snow surface breaks into a clean circle. The section falls as one piece, rotating slightly as it drops, exposing the void beneath. A vertical shaft of blue ice. The walls smooth and cylindrical, descending into darkness. The opening measured perhaps 31 inches across, just wide enough. Darcy Lee Villain dropped straight down. She made no sound, no scream, no shout, no vocal reaction of any kind. The fall was too abrupt for response. Her body simply vanished from the frame. Could anyone react fast enough to change what had already occurred? The fall lasted approximately 1.6 seconds before she disappeared completely from Neil's view. Physics dictates that 1.6 seconds of free fall equals roughly 40 feet of vertical distance, assuming no contact with the shaft walls to slow descent. 40 feet, falling through an ice cylinder into water. The sound followed next. Rushing water. Not the gentle trickle of melt, but the sustained roar of volume and pressure, audible on all 3 recording devices. Neil's phone, Leo's phone, Matok's helmet camera. The sound of a subglacial stream, carved by meltwater over weeks or months, flowing through the glacier's interior in channels that shifted and reformed as the ice moved. Could the sound of the water suggest the impossibility of immediate rescue? Neil Rye's camera kept recording as he lunged forward. The frame shook violently. He dropped to his stomach at the hole's edge, his face briefly appearing as he leaned over the opening. He called her name twice. Matok Sherpa's helmet camera arrived 4 seconds later. The frame shook as he ran the short distance from where he had been standing. He dropped to his knees beside Neil, and both men leaned over the opening. Matok Sherpa pulled back from the edge and immediately began issuing orders. His voice on the helmet camera audio remained controlled and professional, the tone of someone executing trained responses under crisis conditions. He directed Leo to radio base camp with their precise coordinates and situation. At 10:24 a.m., 3 minutes after the collapse, Matok Sherpa began a controlled descent into the opening. At 20 feet depth, the shaft narrowed further. Matok's helmet scraped the wall. He could no longer move his arms freely. The rope above him hung in a straight line, disappearing upward toward the circle of daylight that now seemed impossibly distant. At 23 feet, he stopped. The shaft had tightened to the point where he could not descend further without removing his pack and risking becoming wedged. Below him, perhaps 6 feet down, the shaft appeared to bend sharply or end in a horizontal channel. The sound of water was overwhelming. He began to climb back up. At 10:33 a.m., Maytok radioed the specialized Sherpa team responsible for route maintenance and emergency response in the icefall. He described the situation: client fallen into concealed mill well, depth unknown, active water flow, shaft too narrow for safe rescue below 7 meters. He requested immediate assistance and direction. The reply came back within 2 minutes. The voice on the radio was calm and measured, delivering information that had been assessed many times before in similar scenarios. Mill wells with active water flow are structurally unstable. Descending further risks entrapment and drowning. Without visual confirmation of the victim and a viable extraction method, continued rescue attempts are not advised. Current conditions indicate rising temperatures and increased melt. The site is unsafe for prolonged operations. The meaning was clear. Darcy was unrecoverable. After the incident, Darcy's family was informed through appropriate channels and later traveled to Kathmandu to handle formalities. They requested that her social media presence, particularly her TikTok account, be deactivated out of respect for her memory and to prevent further public scrutiny. Authorities released a statement expressing condolences and reaffirming safety protocols, while the climbing community quietly reflected on the dangers of combining inexperienced climbers, technical ice terrain, and digital distractions. It was August 8, 2017, at Everest Base Camp during the late summer monsoon transition. The tent city remained active with acclimatization and route work, while recent snow and warming cycles had destabilized sections of the Khumbu Glacier, prompting warnings after near-miss ice incidents. Paisley Dalton was a graduate student specializing in human risk behavior in extreme environments. At 33, she approached Everest with academic confidence shaped by years of theoretical study, rather than practical exposure. Her research focused on decision-making under perceived danger, and she had frequently criticized expedition safety policies as overly conservative. Her field experience, however, was limited to controlled observation and short-duration high-altitude travel under supervision. Dalton's stated goal was to document climber behavior during non-peak conditions for thesis material. She viewed guide-imposed restrictions as obstacles to legitimate research rather than safeguards developed through prior fatalities. Despite being advised to remain within established movement windows and to avoid solo travel through unstable sections, she insisted that her academic credentials justified independent movement. She logged her intent to move ahead of her group, stating that her research objectives required autonomy. That morning, Dalton left base camp intent on advancing higher along the standard route through the Khumbu icefall. The climb required deliberate pacing across shifting ladders, crevasse crossings, and unstable ice blocks that constantly changed shape under temperature fluctuations. Other teams moved cautiously in fixed rope lines, spacing themselves carefully to reduce load stress on snow bridges. Dalton focused on documenting conditions and proving her independence in hazardous terrain, separated herself from the structured pace of surrounding climbers as she continued upward. As Dalton moved above the lower camps, conditions deteriorated quickly. Snow bridges across the glacier showed visible signs of weakening, and shifting cloud cover reduced visibility across the route. Guides advised holding position and rerouting around a section of icefall that had been flagged as unstable earlier in the day. Dalton ignored the recommendation and continued forward alone, choosing a shorter line that crossed the compromised area. She paused frequently to document surface features, extending the time spent in hazardous terrain. The glacier surface became increasingly uneven as she progressed. Subtle depressions and thinly covered ice concealed underlying voids, making safe foot placement difficult. Meltwater from recent warming cycles had weakened structural support beneath the snowpack. Without rope support or probing, she stepped onto a section that appeared solid but lacked load-bearing integrity. The snow collapsed beneath her without warning. Dalton fell into a concealed ice depression, striking hard ice during the descent. The impact caused multiple fractures and severe internal injuries. Loose ice and snow followed her into the cavity, further restricting movement and visibility. The confined space prevented self-extraction. Shock and blood loss rapidly limited her ability to move or call for assistance, while exposure to cold ice surfaces accelerated heat loss. Within minutes, her condition deteriorated to the point where coordinated movement was no longer possible. Dalton remained conscious briefly, attempting to call for assistance and stabilize herself, but blood loss and trauma progressed rapidly. Hypothermia compounded her condition as she remained immobilized on exposed ice. She lost consciousness before any assistance could reach her position. Her absence was reported hours later when she failed to check in. Rescue teams located her after conditions stabilized, but she was unresponsive upon arrival. Medical assessment confirmed death due to internal injuries and exposure sustained during the fall. The incident was recorded as a preventable fatality resulting from deviation from established safety protocols. Expedition leaders reinforced restrictions on independent movement and emphasized that academic expertise does not substitute for situational awareness or compliance with guide authority. The case was later referenced in mountaineering safety discussions as an example of how theoretical knowledge can fail catastrophically when it overrides real-world risk controls. It was May 9, 2013. The northeast ridge of Mount Everest stretched under deceptively calm morning skies, the north side route appearing almost benign from base camp. Noah Dasvich, a 31-year-old freelance web designer from Portland, Oregon, stood alone below the first step, already hours behind schedule and critically fatigued. What should have been a calculated summit push would become one of the mountain's most preventable tragedies. Noah had completed a handful of weekend climbs in the Cascades and one guided trek to Kilimanjaro 2 years prior. His decision to attempt Everest stemmed not from years of alpine preparation, but from a budget-conscious philosophy. He documented obsessively on his minimalist travel blog. Friends said that he'd spent months researching ways to summit cheaply, ultimately securing an economy permit through a discount expedition operator for $8,000 rather than the standard $40,000 guided package. Mountain climbing, particularly at extreme altitude, requires precise navigation through technical terrain using crampons, ice axes, and fixed ropes, while managing severe oxygen deprivation that impairs judgment and physical coordination at elevations exceeding 26,000 feet. Noah's blog promised to prove that Everest could be conquered through determination and frugality rather than expensive guides and Sherpa support. That morning, Noah had bypassed the standard 2 a.m. departure window, instead leaving camp at 5:30 a.m., a major deviation from accepted summit practice after oversleeping. Other climbers noted his slow pace and observed him frequently stopping to check his handheld GPS unit, its screen lagging in the cold as he struggled to confirm his position, clearly struggling with route finding. The climbing season was ending, with most commercial teams already descended, leaving large sections of the upper route without maintained fixed ropes and virtually no traffic above Camp 3. By noon, Noah had barely reached the first step, a 30-foot vertical rock band requiring technical climbing at nearly 28,100 feet. Multiple expedition leaders monitoring from lower camps radioed warnings about deteriorating weather conditions and urged any remaining climbers to descend immediately. Noah had no radio. Wind speeds were increasing rapidly, strong enough to destabilize climbers on exposed terrain and complicate any descent approaching dangerous levels. His original plan had called for summiting by 10 a.m. and being back at high camp by early afternoon. Noah stood below the first step for nearly 45 minutes, visibly hesitating according to 2 Russian climbers descending past him. They gestured for him to turn back, but he waved them off. He appeared confused about the correct climbing sequence, repeatedly testing handholds before committing to moves. His crampon technique was amateurish, his movements jerky and uncoordinated from altitude-induced hypoxia, with delayed reactions and poor balance evident even while stationary. At approximately 1:15 p.m., Noah attempted a high front point move on ice-covered rock without properly securing his placement. His right crampon skated off the glazed surface. Unclipped to any fixed line and with no anchor protection above or below him, he immediately lost balance. He attempted a self-arrest, but the ice axe glanced off hard, ice-sheathed rock, and could not arrest his backward fall. Noah's body accelerated down the northeast ridge's steep mixed terrain. He cartwheeled violently down rock slabs before hitting a snowfield, his momentum carrying him roughly 800 feet down the mountain face. The Russian climbers watched helplessly as he disappeared from view. His bright yellow jacket and scattered equipment fragments marked a clear fall fall line across the white snow. The Russians descended to Camp 3 and reported the accident at 3:45 p.m. using an expedition radio after winds and fading light made any immediate approach to the fall line impossible. Recovery operations couldn't begin until the following morning due to dangerous winds and darkness. A Sherpa recovery team located Noah's body at approximately 26,900 feet the next day. His helmet had been torn off during the fall, and his climbing harness showed he'd never clipped into any safety lines. The medical assessment confirmed Noah died from massive head trauma and a severed spinal column. Noah's blog, which detailed his budget approach and dismissed professional guidance as unnecessary luxury, remained online for 7 months before the hosting service suspended it for non-payment. On May 18, 2015, during the height of the spring ascent season on Mount Everest, the Khumbu Icefall entered its most volatile stretch of the day. The route between base camp and Camp Ice cut through a fractured landscape of leaning seracs and compressed ice corridors that shifted continuously under their own weight. By early afternoon, temperatures hovered near 28 degrees Fahrenheit, softening structural bonds and increasing internal stress within the glacier. Shortly after mid-afternoon, climbers monitoring shared radio frequencies heard a report. A mountaineer named David Williams had fallen approximately 80 feet into a confined ice slot known to guides as the Throat. The passage was steep-walled and extremely narrow at its base, limiting both sightlines and access from above. The initial report indicated he was awake but unable to move, with a suspected injury to one leg. Several climbers approached the rim and looked into the crevasse system. From that position, the situation was clear. Any attempt to help would require descending into a constricted ice channel during the warmest and least stable part of the day. The walls were tight, the surface snow was losing firmness, and temperatures were still climbing. One by one, climbers stepped away from the edge. The risk calculations did not favor intervention, and the icefall was already shifting under the afternoon heat. Most accepted that assessment. One did not. Chris Rodriguez, 45, was not acting as a guide and was not responsible for a client. He was moving independently through the icefall when the call came over the radio. While others continued upward, Rodriguez remained at the lip of the canyon, studying the drop below. His hesitation was rooted less in summit plans and more in experience from a previous career. Before dedicating himself to high-altitude climbing, Rodriguez had served as an Army medic. That training shaped his response. He recognized how quickly exposure, shock, and untreated injury could escalate at altitude. From above, it was apparent that the injured climber was conscious yet immobilized, positioned on a narrow shelf with little chance of self-rescue. Rodriguez had spent multiple seasons supporting commercial expeditions, installing fixed lines, carrying loads, and navigating the icefall repeatedly. He understood anchor systems and confined ice terrain, but he was under no obligation to descend. As others cleared the area, he began preparing his harness and rope system. Rescue work inside the Khumbu Icefall carries compounding hazards. The glacier creeps and settles several feet each day, altering crevasse shapes and destabilizing towers of compressed ice. The throat narrowed significantly from top to bottom, roughly 8 feet wide near the rim and tightening to less than 4 feet lower down, with nearly 200 feet of ice rising along both sides. These formations rely heavily on compressive force rather than structural solidity, making them sensitive to even modest temperature shifts. As afternoon warmth intensified, meltwater weakened overhanging sections and created thin, refrozen layers that could shear under weight. The geometry of the chute directed any falling debris straight through its center. There were no natural alcoves or protected zones. Anchor placements that might have held in the morning cold could lose integrity as the ice softened. Standard rescue configurations requiring multiple secure anchors and support personnel became harder to implement as time passed and conditions continued to change. By mid-afternoon, outward movement appeared minimal, but inside the glacier, stress redistribution continued. Ice does not always signal failure with visible cracks or noise. Collapse occurs when cumulative strain surpasses what the compressed structure can withstand. This was the margin Chris was calculating. From above, the canyon appeared stable, but later, analysis determined that parts of this section were no longer structurally locked in place. Several ice formations were being held together by surface friction and opposing pressure rather than solid bonding. The icefall was not actively collapsing. It was under tension, holding. Williams remained conscious but could not climb from where he had landed. Observers at the rim could see him positioned on a small shelf midway down the chute, with no obvious line of ascent. The ledge was irregular and tilted toward the void beneath him. At intervals, fragments of ice dropped past his position, sliding directly through the center of the corridor. Climbers watching from above later stated that he stayed braced against the wall throughout the evaluation, keeping himself steady against the slope. Those gathered at the rim discussed the level of exposure. The chute offered almost no overhead cover, and debris consistently traveled through the exact line a rescuer would need to use. As minutes passed, minor settling noises and sharp cracking sounds became more frequent. It was clear to those present that waiting would not make conditions safer. Once sunlight left the icefall, temperatures would fall quickly, and refreezing could shift the structure into a new and unpredictable configuration. Chris shifted along the edge, scanning the walls for fresh fractures and sections beginning to peel away. He tracked the pattern of falling debris and paused repeatedly as the glacier adjusted under load. Without hesitation, he organized his gear, checking his rope, selecting ice screws appropriate for cold, brittle ice, and positioning his equipment so it would not snag against the narrowing walls. Around him, the icefall emitted steady groans and sharp pops, signs of continued movement rather than a single event. When he finished, he secured himself to the system and leaned back over the lip. The initial section of the descent kept him close to the wall, where the ice mass was thicker. He lowered himself gradually, maintaining centered weight and ensuring the rope stayed clear of abrasive edges. Thin streams of meltwater traced down the surface, refreezing in shaded patches and forming ridges that threatened to catch and drag the line if he lost attention. As Chris lowered himself, the passage constricted around him. The ice walls pressed closer, daylight thinned, and everything shifted into a muted blue haze. He descended in short sections, pausing frequently to examine the surface ahead and reposition his line. Below, David Williams remained seated on the narrow ledge, tracking Chris's approach while small chunks of loosened ice slid past and disappeared down the center of the chute. Closer to the bottom, the interior no longer resembled what had been visible from the rim. Climbers observing from above later described fresh shards adhered to the walls and a thin overhang where runoff had frozen into a shallow lip. As Chris moved downward, his rope skimmed that lip and snagged briefly before slipping loose. Witnesses noted that he corrected immediately, shifting his stance to keep the rope clear of the wall and limit friction within the tight corridor. He slowed again as he descended. From above, it was apparent he was near eye level with Williams. Any further movement meant clearing the rope for the final stretch. Just before the narrowest section, he halted. Post-incident review of photos and witness accounts showed that the walls there angled inward and were uneven, shaped by repeated freeze and thaw cycles. Ice that had looked solid from above revealed thin fractures and layered plates up close, suggesting compression rather than uniform stability. The rope fed cleanly at first, then caught again on a shallow projection jutting from the wall. The ledge was only a few inches thick, formed where water had flowed through a pocket and hardened. It appeared intact, but lacked depth beneath its edge. Chris shifted carefully to guide the rope around it, keeping movements controlled and tension light. In a broader space, the adjustment would have been minor. Inside that confined chute, even small shifts transferred load directly into the surrounding ice. When the rope settled behind the thin shelf, it was no longer a minor hang-up. Later, analysis concluded that tension had begun building within the canyon itself. Force from above pressed directly into the fragile projection, redirecting stress away from thicker sections higher up. The rope was no longer just obstructed, it was bearing weight. With each small adjustment, pressure redistributed through the narrow walls, removing support from within a structure that still appeared steady from above. Below, Williams stayed in place beneath the converging walls. Small fragments continued dropping in a straight line past him. As Chris worked to free the rope, it wedged tighter against the thin lip. Pulling straight risked slicing the line against the edge. Pulling laterally increased strain on the projection. He tested both options lightly, then paused when a low, hollow crack carried through the confined ice. Trying to ease tension on the line, Chris planted his boots against the wall and shifted his weight backward. From above, those watching later said his posture looked strained. Arms lifted, shoulders tight, his body wedged into the narrowing gap. Small shards of ice began snapping loose from the overhang, striking his helmet and harness before falling into the void below. Climbers at the rim saw him freeze as the falling fragments slowed, then noticed faint fractures forming across the ice surface, radiating outward from where the rope pressed into it. He started trimming away at the edge of the ice lip to free the rope, and witnesses said each tap of his tool rang sharply through the confined canyon. After every strike, the ledge shifted slightly, then settled again. A response that might have gone unnoticed on an open face, but echoed inside the tight passage. Several climbers later recalled hearing low, irregular groans from the surrounding ice after each impact. Each time, Chris stopped and waited, holding still until the sounds faded. For a few seconds, nothing moved. Meltwater dripped from higher up the wall, slipping past the shelf and vanishing into the channel below. The rope stayed jammed, pinned hard against the ice. Those watching noticed a fracture running across the shelf had extended during the pause. It appeared darker now, more defined than before. Chris held his position longer than at any other moment during the descent. From above, observers saw him test the rope again. It remained rigid, disappearing behind the overhang, without slack. Fine ice dust filtered down from the crack overhead, falling in thin streaks against the shadowed wall. Several climbers later said the shelf no longer looked the same. The fracture had widened slightly, and when the ice shifted, it did not return to its previous alignment. Small pieces continued to drop, a sign that the surface had lost the stability it showed earlier. The chute around him had tightened to the point that repositioning was limited. Climbing back up meant passing once more through the same constricted section, while the overhang remained under stress. Staying put carried its own danger. The surrounding walls continued to settle, sending occasional fragments down the center of the corridor. From the rim, climbers could see minor adjustments overhead, each piece following the same downward path. There was no clear way to reset the system from where he stood. The only remaining direction was downward. As the moments lengthened, the glacier continued its gradual shift. Nothing dramatic appeared on the surface, but forces inside the canyon redistributed. Ice that had seemed firm earlier was now held together mainly by friction, compressed, and waiting for a small change to disturb the balance. However, Chris placed his weight onto a ledge that was already under strain, leaning forward just enough to push the rope clear of the lip. The response came without delay. A fracture shot across the surface with a sharp report that echoed through the canyon. The ledge did not detach as one solid slab. It separated in stages, sections breaking free one after another, like a center block slipping from a stacked column. The platform dropped beneath him, pulling the rope down as it fell. At the same time, the line went slack, removing the final tension that had kept him pinned to the wall. With no resistance left, Chris tipped backward into the middle of the chute as shattered ice descended around him. The fall did not follow a straight path. The slanted walls deflected him from side to side, driving him into one surface and then the other before channeling him downward. Ice fragments followed the same route, funneled through the narrowing corridor. The canyon functioned like a chute, directing everything toward its center. Above, the rope jerked tight for a split second, then loosened again as debris disrupted its alignment. Smaller shards struck first, ricocheting off the walls, followed by larger blocks that slammed into the passage and fractured. Some pieces exploded on impact. Others held together long enough to plunge deeper into the constricted space. Chris came to a stop lower in the chute where the walls tightened further. In that section, the gap measured less than 4 feet across. Ice continued to pour down from above and shear in from the sides, compressing the area around him until suspension was no longer possible. He was no longer hanging, but pinned in place, fixed by the mass of the collapse as the walls pressed inward. Rescue operations in confined ice terrain rely on layered safeguards, multiple anchor points, secondary descent lines, and stable positions to retreat if conditions deteriorate. In this segment of the canyon, those measures could not be set. The constricted width eliminated side movement, the failed ledge removed upward escape, and the fouled rope blocked the primary line. The method itself remained sound. The terrain shifted too quickly for it to take hold. As the weight was redistributed, the ice higher up fractured and dropped. Each impact compacted the debris surrounding Chris further, locking it under pressure. Force built from above, while the narrowing walls squeezed from both sides, tightening the space. Above the collapse, David Williams was still alive, but immobilized. Below, the area enclosing Chris continued to compress. With each passing minute, the window for survival closed in two different ways, leaving no point where both hazards diminished together. We're only halfway through this Everest rescue gone wrong, so subscribe if you want to see how one technical decision on the world's highest mountain can erase every chance of survival in minutes. Then the line went still. From his position on the ledge, Williams watched the rope sink into newly fallen ice and failed to emerge again. It no longer paid out or twitched when tension shifted. The glacier had shifted around it, pinning it in place. The anchors above remained secure, but the section below had been swallowed. What had been an open descent path only minutes earlier was now a compressed shaft of fractured ice filling the chute. Beneath that obstruction, Chris was still alive. Radio records later reviewed confirmed that he survived the initial collapse. Irregular breathing came through first, followed by brief scraping sounds as he attempted to reposition his arms. The void around him began tightening almost at once. Ice pressed inward against his legs, ribs, and shoulders as debris compacted under its own weight instead of settling loosely. An opening that had measured several feet across narrowed quickly to less than 2. Each movement he made dislodged more fragments, and sharp, brittle cracks snapped through the canyon as pressure continued to transfer downward. From above, Williams lost a clear view. Curtains of hanging ice and drifting shards obscured the lower chute, allowing only brief glimpses when light caught on falling pieces. He later reported that debris continued funneling directly down the center, striking the walls, splintering, and vanishing into the growing mass below without slowing. At first, Williams heard Chris calling upward. The voice carried thinly along the ice walls, uneven and strained. As more material settled, the calls ceased. Breathing followed, audible but growing heavier, separated by longer gaps. Small chunks of ice slid past Williams's boots, each fragment taking the same straight path downward. None lodged against the sides. All of it fed into the same constricting space. The shape of the canyon began to change. Loose fragments packed tightly together, and the drop beneath Williams appeared shorter and more solid as the opening filled. Large shifts ended first. After that came smaller, constant adjustments, as the ice locked into denser positions. The radio signal weakened in parallel. The breathing that had come through clearly faded into shallow bursts, then blended with the background noise of the icefall itself. Low groans and distant fractures echoed through the passage, making it difficult to separate glacier movement from human sound. Then the transmission stopped. Williams remained in place while the chute completed its closure. The debris no longer shifted in slabs. It compressed under weight until it formed a single, compacted block. The space where Chris had descended was no longer identifiable as a passage. It had merged back into the glacier. At the surface, little appeared altered. The icefall continued its gradual motion, and the route along the rim held for the time being. From above, there was no visible indication of what had just been sealed beneath the ice. As the chute continued to compress, the lower corridor closed off entirely. The vertical route became packed from wall to wall with tightly driven ice. Pieces that had fallen separately minutes before were now forced together under pressure, creating a dense barrier that still carried weight and subtle movement. From the rim, climbers could see that the debris was no longer shifting in large slabs. It settled in small, steady adjustments, compacting as the load redistributed. Any descent through that section would have meant cutting into ice that remained under stress and capable of failing again. From his narrow perch, Williams no longer had a clear drop beneath him. The open space that had existed earlier had been replaced by a wall of compressed fragments. Small shards continued to break free from above, sliding past his position and vanishing into the sealed mass below. The geometry of the canyon had altered so completely that the original channel was no longer recognizable. As evening approached, temperatures began to fall. The icefall responded by constricting. Meltwater that had moved through the chute earlier froze where it lay, binding loose debris together and increasing rigidity. Sections that had been flexing began to stiffen, reducing visible motion but concentrating stress within the formation. By then, Williams had remained on the ledge for several hours, exposed and unable to reposition himself without help. The extended pause, though risky, allowed surface layers to firm enough to consider a measured approach from above. The route chosen did not follow the initial line of descent. Instead, climbers shifted position higher along the rim and began traversing toward a separate section where the ice was thicker and less disturbed. Establishing access required installing fresh anchors and testing each placement before committing full weight. Progress was deliberate. Every move was made with the understanding that the icefall continued to adjust beneath the cooling air. Once a secure line reached Williams, he was clipped in and guided off the ledge. The operation moved slowly, as small pieces of ice continued to fall intermittently and the confined space limited maneuverability. After attachment, he was raised in controlled increments, stopping frequently to prevent additional debris from breaking loose. By the time he reached the surface, the lower canyon had compacted completely, leaving no visible cavity or downward route. No comparable effort could be made for Chris. The section below had consolidated into a dense block extending dozens of feet down the passage. Access would have required mechanical cutting tools and extended time within a confined part of the icefall that remained under load. Any intrusion carried the possibility of triggering a secondary collapse, potentially greater than the first. In the days that followed, the glacier continued its gradual movement downhill. The sealed area traveled with it, and the canyon where Chris had descended shifted once more. Corners rounded off, fresh fractures opened elsewhere, and the icefall absorbed the collapse into its changing surface, erasing the sharp edges until the original passage was no longer distinguishable. There was no retrieval. Chris Rodriguez was never brought off the mountain. Within hours of the collapse, the ice corridor where he had descended no longer existed in its original form. The narrow chute had compressed into a dense block of fractured ice and debris as the glacier continued its slow downhill flow. The rope he had clipped into was pulled beneath the surface, disappearing into hardened ice just below the anchor point. Assessments later concluded that reaching the lower section would have required cutting into ice that remained under tension and was still actively shifting. Official documentation classified the event as a disappearance inside the Khumbu icefall, resulting from an ice collapse during a rescue effort. No memorial marker could be set at the location. The glacier does not hold a fixed position long enough to mark. In the days that followed, the established route through the icefall was redirected away from the site. Ladders were repositioned, fixed lines were reset, and teams adjusted to newly opened crevasses nearby. The collapsed channel blended back into the surrounding terrain, leaving no clear indication that a rescue had been attempted there. A post-incident review determined that Rodriguez survived the initial structural failure, but died from compressive asphyxia, combined with crushing trauma as compacting ice closed in around him. As the glacier settled, the confined space around his torso decreased until chest expansion was no longer possible. Radio transmissions captured during the event described increasing difficulty with breathing rather than sudden silence, consistent with progressive external pressure instead of instant fatal injury. The findings indicated that the collapse sealed him inside the ice while he was still alive. David Williams was later removed through an alternate access point and survived his injuries. Days afterward, the small ledge where he had been stranded failed during another afternoon warming cycle, erasing the last recognizable feature of the original fall site. By season's end, nothing distinguished the area from the rest of the icefall. The glacier continued its steady descent, reshaping crevasses and towers without interruption. Chris Rodriguez remained officially listed as missing, taken into moving ice that offered no recovery, no permanent marker, and no return path. In early April 2016, the Khumbu Glacier groaned beneath a sprawling city of tents at 17,600 feet. Everest Base Camp was a chaotic sprawl of expedition compounds, communication tents, and dining shelters where climbers from dozens of countries readied themselves for their attempts on the summit. The glacier shifted constantly beneath them, a reminder that they were camped on moving ice. Prayer flags strung between boulders snapped in the wind, their colors bleached by the relentless high-altitude sun. Among the new arrivals completing final preparations was a 53-year-old American named David Hartley, a retired orthopedic surgeon from Boulder, who had spent 2 years planning what he believed would be the defining achievement of his life. David had discovered mountaineering in his late 30s during a medical conference in Chamonix. What started as a casual hike up a minor peak in the French Alps had sparked an obsession that would consume his free time for the next 15 years. He had climbed extensively in the Colorado Rockies, knocked off several 14ers in Alaska, and completed successful expeditions to Aconcagua and Denali. His colleagues at the hospital had never grasped the appeal. They viewed David as reckless, gambling a successful career and comfortable life for frozen summits that offered nothing but bragging rights. But David understood something they didn't, that the mountains stripped away everything superfluous and revealed what truly mattered: On a summit, there were no politics, no malpractice concerns, no difficult patients or hospital administrators. There was only the wind, the snow, and the simple question of whether you had what it took to survive. Everest had always been his ultimate objective, the crowning achievement of a climbing career that had provided refuge from the pressures of his surgical practice and the wreckage of a marriage that had ended in divorce when his son Michael was 12. The divorce had been brutal, as divorces often are, and David's relationship with his son had deteriorated during the years that followed. Michael had lived primarily with his mother in Denver, and the weekends David had been promised often dissolved due to surgical emergencies or climbing trips that couldn't be postponed. By the time Michael graduated from high school, father and son had become polite strangers, connected by blood but little else. David had watched from a distance as Michael drifted through community college, cycled through a series of forgettable jobs, and seemed to lack any clear direction in life. But David also carried a critical blind spot that would prove fatal. He was incapable of recognizing weakness in his own plans. His previous high-altitude experience, while impressive by amateur standards, had not prepared him for the unique demands of Everest. Denali's summit reached 20,310 feet. Aconcagua topped out at 22,838 feet. These were serious mountains that commanded respect and preparation. But Everest was something else entirely. 29,032 feet of altitude, where the margin for error shrank to almost nothing, and the consequences of mistakes were measured in frozen bodies rather than bruised egos. The commercial guiding industry had made Everest more accessible, but it hadn't made it safer. If anything, it had fostered a false sense of security that led inexperienced climbers to attempt things they had no business attempting. The idea of climbing Everest together had come to David during a solo trek in Nepal 3 years earlier. Standing at Everest Base Camp as a tourist, watching the expeditions prepare for their summit pushes, he had been seized by a vision of himself and his son, Michael, on that summit together. It would be more than a climb. It would be redemption, an opportunity to rebuild the relationship he had neglected for so long. He would share his greatest passion with his son, and in doing so, perhaps finally become the father he had always intended to be. Michael Hartley was 24 years old, and he had inherited his mother's quiet temperament and her tendency toward introspection. He was intelligent but unmotivated, capable but unwilling to commit himself to anything that required sustained effort. His apartment was littered with half-finished projects, a guitar he had stopped learning, language books he had never cracked past chapter 3, exercise equipment collecting dust in the corner. He had few close friends and spent most evenings alone, gaming online with strangers he would never meet. It was a small life, comfortable in its limitations, and Michael had made peace with it. Convincing Michael had taken months of careful persuasion. The young man had shown little interest in mountaineering, preferring video games and the comfortable routines of his basement apartment, any form of outdoor adventure. But David was persistent, and he knew how to frame the opportunity in terms his son couldn't refuse. He would cover everything: the training, the equipment, the expedition fees that totaled nearly $80,000 per person. All Michael had to do was commit to 2 years of preparation and follow his father up the mountain. What David didn't fully grasp was how unprepared his son truly was, not just physically, but psychologically. Michael had never spent a night above 10,000 feet before his father's proposition. He had agreed to the Everest expedition partly to please his father, partly because the adventure sounded exciting in the abstract, and partly because he had nothing better to do with his life. The training regimen David designed was rigorous: gym sessions, altitude simulation, practice climbs on Colorado 14ers, and Michael had completed it all with adequate, if not exceptional, results. He had lost 30 pounds and built genuine cardiovascular fitness. But fitness and mountaineering experience were different things, and no amount of treadmill work could replicate the psychological demands of spending weeks in the death zone. The practice climbs in Colorado had exposed cracks in Michael's readiness that David chose to minimize. On their first attempt at Long's Peak, Michael had turned back at 13,000 feet, overwhelmed by the exposure and the thinning air. David had attributed the failure to nerves and pushed for another attempt the following month. Michael completed the climb that time, but his pace had been painfully slow, and he had spent the descent in near silence, his face pale and his hands trembling. Similar patterns surfaced on subsequent training climbs. Michael would finish, but barely, his body driven to limits that left nothing in reserve. David saw determination where he should have seen warning signs. The expedition was led by a well-regarded commercial outfitter with decades of Everest experience. The team included 8 paying clients, 3 Western guides, and a support staff of 12 Sherpas who would establish camps, fix ropes, and ferry supplies up the mountain. The first few days at base camp had been filled with an almost festive energy. Climbers from different expeditions mingled in the mess tents, trading stories of previous adventures and speculating about the weather windows to come. David had thrived in this environment, his natural charisma drawing people into conversation, his experience on other peaks earning him respect among the team. Michael, by contrast, had withdrawn into himself. He spent hours in their shared tent, reading or sleeping, emerging only for meals and mandatory briefings. When David tried to draw him into the camaraderie of camp life, Michael would engage briefly before finding a reason to retreat. The distance between them, which David had hoped the expedition would close, seemed only to widen. The acclimatization period had gone smoothly at first. David and Michael made the required rotations up the mountain, sleeping at progressively higher camps to allow their bodies to adapt to the diminishing oxygen. They pushed through the Khumbu icefall together, threading the maze of ladder crossings and tottering ice towers that had killed more climbers than any other section of the route. The icefall was a frozen waterfall in slow motion, constantly shifting and collapsing as gravity dragged the glacier down the mountain. Climbers crossed it in darkness to reduce the risk of collapse, their headlamps illuminating walls of blue ice that could topple without warning. But as the weeks passed and the altitude increased, Michael began to struggle in ways that alarmed the expedition's lead guide, a veteran named James Whitfield, who had summited Everest 6 times. Michael's pace slowed dramatically above 23,000 feet, and he developed a persistent cough that suggested the early stages of high-altitude pulmonary edema. During a rest day at Camp 2, Whitfield had pulled David aside and voiced his concerns in direct terms. He questioned whether Michael was physically and mentally prepared for a summit attempt, and suggested that it might be prudent to consider turning back. David's response had been defensive, almost hostile. He insisted that Michael was simply experiencing normal altitude adjustment and would perform better once they began the actual summit push. He pointed to his son's successful completion of the training program and the practice climbs in Colorado. He reminded Whitfield of the substantial fees he had paid for this expedition and the years of planning that had gone into making it happen. The guide had backed down, acknowledging David's points while making clear that the final summit decision would rest with the climbing team's assessment at Camp 4. What Whitfield didn't know was that David had been secretly supplementing Michael's performance with medication. An old colleague from his surgical days had provided David with a supply of dexamethasone, a powerful corticosteroid that could temporarily mask the symptoms of altitude sickness. David had been giving Michael the pills since Camp 2, disguising their true purpose by telling his son they were vitamins to boost energy. The drugs worked in the short term, reducing inflammation and creating the illusion of acclimatization. But they were a dangerous deception, concealing warning signs that existed for a reason while doing nothing to address the underlying physiological problems. The weather window arrived on May 18th, one of the best of the season. A brief period of high pressure would deliver calm winds and clear skies for approximately 36 hours before the next storm system arrived. The expedition's meteorologist had been monitoring the pattern for days, and when he gave the green light, the entire team mobilized for their summit attempt. Pre-dawn darkness enveloped Camp 4 on the South Col, positioned at 26,000 feet in the realm climbers call the Death Zone. The wind had finally dropped to a manageable howl after 3 days of storms that had trapped expeditions in their tents. The temperature hovered around minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to freeze exposed flesh in minutes, but remarkably mild by Everest standards. Above the col, the summit pyramid rose another 3,000 vertical feet into the starlit sky, its black rock and white snow barely visible against the darkness. The South Col itself was a desolate place, a windswept saddle of ice and shattered rock littered with the debris of decades of expeditions. Abandoned oxygen bottles lay half buried in the snow, their faded labels testament to climbers who had passed through years or even decades before. Shredded tent fabric flapped from twisted poles, and frozen ropes snaked across the terrain like the shed skins of enormous serpents. Nothing lived here permanently. The altitude was too great, the conditions too severe. Humans could survive in the death zone for hours, perhaps days, but never longer. The body began dying the moment it arrived, consuming itself in the thin air, where each breath delivered only a third of the oxygen available at sea level. David felt a surge of excitement as he helped Michael prepare in the pre-dawn darkness. This was it. After all the planning, all the training, all the money and effort, they were finally going to stand on top of the world together. The hours before departure were filled with meticulous preparation. David checked and rechecked their oxygen supplies, ensuring the regulators were functioning and the bottles were full. He helped Michael into his summit suit, adjusting straps and zippers with hands that trembled slightly from anticipation. Michael moved through the preparations like a sleepwalker, his responses sluggish and his eyes distant. David attributed it to pre-climb nerves, the same anxiety that gripped every climber before a major summit attempt. He didn't consider that his son might already be displaying signs of the altitude sickness that would kill him. The climb from Camp 4 to the summit typically took between 10 and 14 hours, depending on conditions and the fitness of the climbers. The route led up a steep snow slope to a rock formation called the Balcony at 27,600 feet, then traversed along an exposed ridge to the south summit at 28,700 feet. From there, climbers faced the most technical section of the entire route, a knife-edge ridge leading to the Hillary Step, a 40-foot wall of rock and ice that marked the final obstacle before the summit. The return journey added another 6 to 8 hours, meaning that climbers departing at midnight could expect to arrive back at Camp 4 sometime between late afternoon and midnight the following day. The Hartleys departed Camp 4 at 11:45 p.m. on May 17th, joining a line of headlamps that stretched up into the darkness. The team moved in a staggered formation, with the strongest climbers at the front and the guides distributed throughout to monitor the slower members. Michael started near the back of the group, his movements already labored despite the relatively early hour. David stayed close to his son, offering encouragement and checking his oxygen regulator at regular intervals. The cold was brutal, seeping through layers of down and Gore-Tex to find the vulnerable flesh beneath. Each breath of bottled oxygen was a small mercy, but even with supplemental air, the effort of climbing felt like running a marathon while breathing through a straw. The first sign of serious trouble came at approximately 2:30 a.m. as the team approached the balcony. Michael had fallen significantly behind the main group, his pace slowing to a crawl despite the fixed ropes that should have made the climbing straightforward. David could hear his son's ragged breathing even through the wind, each exhale accompanied by a wet, rattling sound that suggested fluid in the lungs. He asked Michael how he felt, and his son responded that he was just tired but could keep going. The words came out slurred and disconnected, and David told himself it was just the altitude affecting his speech. At the balcony, Whitfield called a mandatory rest stop to assess the team's condition. Several climbers were showing signs of fatigue, but Michael's state was clearly the worst. He sat slumped against a rock, barely responsive to questions, his oxygen mask fogged with condensation from his labored breathing. Whitfield checked Michael's oxygen flow rate and found it already at maximum. He shone a light into Michael's eyes and noted the sluggish pupil response that indicated cerebral edema, swelling of the brain caused by altitude. He told David that Michael needed to descend immediately, that continuing upward would likely kill him. David refused to accept the assessment. He argued that Michael just needed more rest, that the symptoms would improve once they started moving again, that they had come too far to turn back now. The argument grew heated, voices raised despite the effort it required at altitude. Other team members watched uncomfortably as father and guide clashed over the fate of the expedition. Finally, Whitfield made his position clear. Michael would not continue to the summit with the main team. If David wanted to proceed, he would need to do so without his son. The decision that followed would haunt David Hartley for the rest of his life. After several minutes of agonized deliberation, he made a choice that placed his summit ambitions above his son's safety. He arranged for one of the junior guides, a young man named Thomas Chen, to escort Michael back down to Camp 4, while David continued toward the summit with the main group. David told himself that Michael would be fine, that the descent would reverse the altitude sickness, that they would reunite at camp, and celebrate David's success together. He told Michael to be strong, to trust the guide, and that he would see him in a few hours. Michael barely seemed to register his father's words. His eyes were glassy and unfocused, his responses delayed and muddled, but he nodded vaguely when asked if he understood the plan, and David chose to interpret that nod as consent. He watched for a moment as Chen began helping Michael to his feet, then turned and followed the rest of the team up into the darkness. He didn't look back. The next several hours were a blur of exhaustion and determination for David Hartley. He pushed through the traverse to the south summit, climbed the Hillary step on shaking legs, and finally stood on the true summit of Everest at 7:23 a.m. on May 18th. The view was everything he had imagined, an endless panorama of peaks and clouds stretching to every horizon, the curvature of the earth visible at the edges of his vision. Prayer flags snapped in the wind, left by previous climbers as offerings to the mountain gods. He had realized his lifelong dream. But even in that moment of triumph, a cold dread was building in his stomach. He had heard nothing from Chen or Michael since leaving the balcony. His radio calls had gone unanswered. The descent was faster than the ascent, gravity and fear driving David downward at a pace that bordered on recklessness. He reached the balcony at approximately 11 a.m. and found Chen waiting there alone. The young guide's face told the story before any words were spoken. Michael had collapsed approximately 500 feet below the balcony, his body simply shutting down, despite Chen's best efforts to keep him moving. Chen had administered emergency oxygen and dexamethasone, had tried to physically carry Michael down the steep terrain, but the young man's condition had deteriorated too rapidly. By the time Chen was forced to stop and radio for help, Michael was barely conscious. The descent from the balcony had been a nightmare from the beginning, Chen explained. Michael could barely stand, let alone walk, and every step demanded physical support. They had managed perhaps 200 feet before Michael's legs simply stopped working. He had collapsed into the snow, his body convulsing with the effort to breathe. Chen had dragged him to a relatively sheltered spot beside a rock outcrop and tried everything in his training, adjusting the oxygen flow, administering medication, wrapping Michael in an emergency blanket. Nothing worked. The cerebral edema had progressed too far, and Michael's brain was slowly being crushed by its own swelling. In his final conscious moments, Michael had mumbled something that Chen couldn't quite make out. Perhaps a question, perhaps a name. Then his eyes had closed, and he had stopped responding entirely. David found his son approximately 2 hours later, lying in the snow beside the fixed ropes at around 27,000 feet. Michael's face was peaceful, almost serene, his eyes closed and his features relaxed in a way that David hadn't seen since Michael was a small child. But his skin was gray, and there was no rise and fall of his chest beneath the down suit. Frost had already begun to form on his eyelashes and the edges of his oxygen mask. David collapsed beside his son's body and screamed into the wind, a sound of pure anguish that was swallowed by the vastness of the mountain. He grabbed Michael's shoulders, shaking him, pleading with him to wake up, refusing to accept what his medical training told him was undeniably true. Chen had to physically pull David away from his son's body. There was nothing that could be done at this altitude, he explained. They were still in the death zone, still at risk of joining Michael in death if they didn't continue descending. The body would have to stay where it was. Recovery at this altitude was effectively impossible, and Michael would become one of the estimated 200 corpses that remained on Everest's slopes, grim landmarks for future climbers passing on their way to the summit. The final hours of David's descent were a nightmare of guilt and grief. He moved mechanically, following Chen's directions without conscious thought, his mind replaying every decision that had led to this outcome. He thought about the years he had missed of Michael's childhood, the divorce that had driven them apart, the desperate plan to reconnect that had instead led to his son's death. He thought about the dexamethasone he had secretly administered, the warning signs he had dismissed, the moment at the balcony when he had chosen the summit over his son's life. The mountain had given him everything he wanted, and in return, it had taken everything that mattered. David Hartley reached Camp 4 at approximately 4:30 p.m. on May 18th, roughly 17 hours after departing for the summit. He was hypothermic, frostbitten on 3 fingers and both feet, and in a state of psychological shock that would require months of professional treatment. He had achieved his lifelong dream of summiting Everest, but the cost had been everything that mattered. The investigation that followed was brief but damning. The expedition company's report noted multiple failures in judgment, including the decision to continue pushing an unqualified climber to extreme altitude and the apparent use of undisclosed medication to mask altitude sickness symptoms. Several team members provided statements describing David's refusal to accept Whitfield's assessment at the balcony. David Hartley faced no criminal charges. Everest exists in a legal gray zone where individual responsibility is difficult to assign and enforce. But within the climbing community, his reputation was destroyed. The father who had abandoned his struggling son on the mountain to chase his own summit became a cautionary tale, whispered about in base camps and climbing gyms around the world as an example of ambition corrupting judgment. David Hartley never climbed again. He returned to Boulder a broken man, haunted by the memory of his son's peaceful face in the snow, and the knowledge that his own choices had put him there. Michael's body remains on Everest to this day, preserved by the cold at 27,000 feet, a permanent monument to a father's tragic failure to protect the one person who trusted him most. It was July 15, 2013, at Grand Teton Base Camp during an unusually warm summer. East-face routes showed instability from rapid morning warming and freeze-thaw cycles, prompting guides to warn of increased rockfall and postpone climbs until conditions stabilized. Cambria Fullerton, 35, was a corporate attorney from Jackson, Wyoming, whose career was built on persistence and asserting control in high-pressure situations. She approached mountaineering with the same mindset, viewing technical routes as challenges to negotiate rather than hazards to respect. Her climbing experience included non-technical peaks that required endurance, but she had no prior exposure to multi-pitch climbs or routes demanding rope systems and anchor placement. Fullerton's goal was to complete Exum Ridge in a single day to meet personal deadlines, framing guides as service providers whose recommendations could be challenged rather than safety authorities. By mid-morning, Fullerton had begun ascending the lower sections of Exum Ridge. The sun had warmed the east face, casting sharp shadows across jagged rock formations. Loose stones shifted under each footfall, and the thin mountain air carried the scent of heated rock and alpine vegetation. She moved deliberately along the exposed pitches, testing handholds and placing climbing protection, while remaining fully aware of the warnings about unstable terrain. The route demanded constant attention, but Fullerton's focus was split between rapid progression and documenting her climb for personal records. Despite multiple briefings warning of unstable rockfall zones and posted trail closures, Fullerton insisted on continuing. She repeatedly pressured her guide to maintain schedule objectives, dismissed route modifications, and advanced ahead of recommended safety pacing. During early morning exposure at the lower saddle, she ignored falling debris while documenting conditions, asserting that signed waivers and her own judgment justified her choices. Her guides cautioned that thermal expansion and loose rock made certain sections highly unstable, but Fullerton prioritized speed and completion over precaution. As Fullerton climbed higher along the Exum Ridge, the warming sun had already begun loosening small stones along the ridge's upper sections. The exposed metamorphic rock, fractured and jagged from previous freeze-thaw cycles, created a precarious environment where even minor thermal expansion could trigger large-scale rockfall. Fullerton moved quickly, placing protection as she ascended, but a dislodged boulder, roughly 25 pounds, plummeted from an overhanging ledge above her position. It struck her helmet directly, crushing the protective shell and transmitting extreme force through her skull. The impact caused immediate severe traumatic brain injury and cervical spine fractures, disrupting all voluntary nervous system function. The force of the strike broke Fullerton's grip on handholds, causing her to swing slightly before the climbing rope arrested her descent. She dangled precariously from her anchors, unable to support her own weight or regain control. Her body remained rigid from the combination of shock and injury, and loose debris continued to fall from above, striking the rope and surrounding rock surfaces. The sudden movement and vibration added further instability to the immediate area, forcing her guide to maintain tension on the belay line while assessing the situation from above, fully aware that any sudden motion could worsen the injury. Blood from cranial trauma began to soak through her clothing, and her breathing became irregular and shallow, indicating severe neurological compromise. Despite the guide's attempts to provide reassurance and prepare for technical rescue, Fullerton remained unresponsive, with agonal gasps marking the initial stages of brainstem failure. Hypothermia began to develop as she hung suspended in the thin alpine air, the combination of cold wind and metabolic shock compounding the effects of her injuries. Her guide immediately radioed rescue operations, but the narrow, steep terrain prevented immediate medical intervention. Technical ground teams required specialized rope and anchor systems to reach her position safely. By the time rescuers arrived several hours later, Fullerton was confirmed deceased from blunt force trauma sustained during the rockfall. The medical examiner determined the cause of death as severe traumatic brain injury with cervical spine fractures, noting that the incident resulted from natural objective hazards rather than equipment failure or guide negligence. Grand Teton National Park issued a formal report on the fatality, and guide services subsequently reinforced hazard acknowledgement protocols and emphasized that client timelines must yield to environmental safety, especially in thermal rockfall conditions.